There is something very strange happening with the American dream. More and more people are leaving places that are too expensive, too crowded, and too difficult to live in to search for something very simple. Space, a house with a yard, a road without traffic jams, a more pleasant tax rate, and most importantly, the feeling that my salary is still enough to live a decent life. But this is the interesting part. When thousands, then millions of people share the same idea, space begins to disappear. Places once called hidden gems are starting to see new subdivisions. The quiet streets are becoming crowded. House prices are rising. Infrastructure must keep up with the population. And in 2026, this trend will be further driven by people from outside the United States, including Europeans seeking a more breathable economic environment. So which 10 states are at risk of becoming victims of their own success? And what will happen when people run away from the overload, only to create a new place of overload? That's the real story. If you think the story of Americans and newcomers seeking the promised land revolves only around Florida, Texas, or Nashville, then Alabama might be a name that makes you pause for a moment. Because Alabama doesn't have the glamorous beaches like Florida, the huge brands like Texas, nor does it need to turn itself into an entertainment capital like Nashville. What Alabama has is much simpler. The numbers are still relatively reasonable. According to sources, the housing market here still feels like it's going back to the 1990s, with larger homes but without necessarily having to pay a price that makes buyers seek permission from the bank before dreaming of the American dream. But this is the noteworthy part. Alabama doesn't just rely on being cheap. Huntsville is developing into a hub for aerospace, defense, engineering, and technology with the NASA Marshall Space Flight Center and major military facilities. In other words, Alabama has a rather unusual combination: relatively affordable housing along with high-skilled jobs. And, for an average family, that's the formula worth paying attention to. Because the American dream sometimes doesn't require a mansion or a swimming pool in the backyard, it can just be a house that's big enough, a stable job, and still having some money left in the account at the end of the month. But Alabama also shows us the first downside of this wave of migration. The development is uneven. Huntsville and the Gulf Coast may resemble accelerating economic islands, while many rural areas are still growing more slowly. And if you prefer controlled growth, Alabama is still quite appealing. But what happens when a quiet place suddenly gets discovered by too many people? If Alabama is where the numbers still make sense, then the next state is an example of what happens after the whole country discovers a hidden gem. Idaho is waiting for us, and the story there will make the concept of local home prices much more interesting. The quickest way to destroy a hidden gem is to tell everyone it exists. And that is almost exactly the story of Idaho. For many years, Idaho has attracted those looking for a more spacious and quiet kind of America. Mountains, lakes, open spaces, low population density, and a sense of freedom that many believe is becoming increasingly hard to find in big cities. Boise, Meridian, Nampa, or Coeur d'Alene once evoked images of places where you could buy a house, drive out of the city, and still feel like you were living in nature. But then more and more people discovered that secret. And here's the interesting twist. Not all newcomers bring Idaho-level incomes with them. Some people sell their expensive homes in California and bring that money to Idaho. Remote workers can even continue to earn Silicon Valley-style salaries while living in a lower-cost market. For a family with a limited budget, this creates quite an uncomfortable competition. They are not only competing with neighbors in town, but also with the purchasing power coming from more expensive markets. And that's when the word affordable starts to become relative. Boise, Meridian, Nampa, and Coeur d'Alene are growing rapidly. Two-lane roads are becoming construction sites, pastures are turning into new subdivisions, and the feeling of living far from everything is gradually giving way to a very practical question. How far are we from there now? If you've ever lived in a quiet neighborhood and then watched as each vacant lot turned into a new house, you'll understand this feeling. No one did anything wrong, but when you add up all the small changes, the place you once knew has become something entirely different. And if you're still following along, let me know. Would you be willing to pay more for a quieter place to live? Or is the quietness something you wouldn't want to lose at any cost? Because Idaho is showing us a very American rule. People run to places with space until they themselves become the reason that space disappears. But Idaho is just a matter of land and purchasing power. The next state takes the story to an even more difficult negotiating limit: water. And in Arizona, you can build thousands of new homes, but there's one thing you can't simply order from Amazon. That is water. Phoenix can build an additional 10,000 houses. A much harder question is, where will the water for those 10,000 houses come from? And this is when the story of migration to Arizona becomes much more interesting. Phoenix, Tucson, Queen Creek, or Buckeye have a very clear appeal. A warm climate, new residential areas, houses rising quickly, and the feeling that there is still plenty of room for development in the desert. But the desert has a rather cold principle. Land can be subdivided, money can build houses, but water cannot just be created at will. Arizona relies significantly on groundwater and the Colorado River system, while prolonged drought, increasing water usage, and climate pressures make the situation more complex. And this is the paradox that an ordinary homebuyer finds it very difficult to see on a real estate brochure. Outside the window, there may be a brand new subdivision, but underground, there is a different calculation about how long the water supply can last. Notably, some areas around Phoenix have begun to restrict or pause new subdivisions when assurances about groundwater supply do not meet requirements. That shows the issue is no longer simply whether Arizona has land to build on, but has turned into a more difficult question. Does Arizona have enough resources to sustain this growth rate? And this is also where the story touches the emotions of ordinary people. A family buying their first home doesn't care too much about terms like groundwater recharge or Colorado River allocation. They just need to know if the faucet runs, if the bills are manageable, and if the house they buy today will still be a reasonable choice in 10 years. If you find this type of analysis interesting, a like or subscribe will help me continue to delve into the less discussed aspects of this migration story. Because Arizona is giving us a rather simple lesson. You can build a dream in the desert, but that dream still needs water. And if Arizona is facing resource limits, the next state has another limit that people often forget to factor into the price of a house: time. Let's head to Georgia. The house could be cheaper. But the harder question is, how many years of your life are you willing to pay to get it? This is one of the most interesting hidden costs of the wave of migration to Georgia. According to sources, the median home price in this state is set at around $425,000, $430,000, a figure that can still be attractive compared to many more expensive markets. But as more and more people flock to Atlanta and the surrounding areas in search of a larger home, the story begins to change. The price of the house doesn't always reflect the overall cost of living. Atlanta keeps expanding outward. New residential areas are appearing further from the center, land is being developed, larger houses are being built, and then another thing is also starting to stretch out: the commute. The residents here say that traffic congestion in Atlanta is among the most severe in the United States. And here is the notable twist. You can save tens of thousands of USD when buying a house in the suburbs, but if you have to spend hours on the road every day, that saving is being paid for with a non-refundable currency: time. That particularly affects ordinary families. A father might be happy because he finally bought a house with a yard for his child, but if he has to leave home while it's still dark and return when dinner is almost over, then a bigger house sometimes comes with less life. You buy more space for the house, but lose space in your own day. And if you are living in Georgia, I would really like to know, do you choose a bigger house with a longer commute, or a smaller house but gain a few extra hours each week for your family? Because here's the noteworthy part. As people continue to search for more affordable areas, they are forced to move further away, and the farther they go, the greater the pressure on roads, infrastructure, and suburban communities. A cheaper house might solve one family's problem, but thousands of families doing the same could create a whole new problem. And if Georgia shows that affordability can be paid for with time, the next state has an even more dangerous advantage. It seems to have almost everything someone looking to move to the U.S. could be searching for. Let's go to North Carolina. Want to work in banking? Charlotte. Want to work in technology? Research? Raleigh and Research Triangle. Want the beach? There's Wilmington. Want mountains? There's Asheville. At some point, you'll have to ask a rather funny question. Is there anything North Carolina doesn't have? And it is precisely this diversity that makes the state such a strong magnet for residents. North Carolina consistently ranks among the leaders in net domestic migration, meaning the number of people moving in significantly exceeds the number of people leaving. The special thing is that North Carolina does not need to rely on a single industry. Charlotte has finance. Research Triangle has technology, research, and education, while the coast and mountains create a completely different appeal for those who prioritize quality of life. For a family considering moving to another state, this is a significant advantage. You don't have to bet your entire future on one city or one profession. One person can find a job in Charlotte, their partner can work in research near Raleigh, and on weekends, the whole family can drive to the beach or the mountains. It's like a buffet of the American dream. Everyone takes what they like. But the buffet has a problem. If too many people step in at once, the table starts to get crowded. Research Triangle and the suburbs of Charlotte are expanding rapidly, and the lands that were once farmland are increasingly giving way to master-planned communities. A newly moved-in family might only see a beautiful house and a new neighborhood, but a long-time resident living there might see something different. The familiar fields disappearing, the roads becoming busier, schools having to adapt more quickly, and the spaces that once made it feel like home gradually shrinking. It's a very quiet kind of change. You don't lose a place in a day. Sometimes you lose it subdivision by subdivision. And if you find stories like this worth delving into, please like and subscribe, because the further down the list we go, the clearer we see a paradox. The most attractive states can also be the ones under the greatest pressure from that very attraction. But North Carolina still has one advantage: space. So what happens when even the terrain starts to become a bottleneck? The answer will be found in Utah. Just take a look at the map of Utah once, and you'll immediately understand the issue. On one side are the massive mountain ranges, arid lands, and famous national parks like Zion, Arches, Bryce Canyon, Capitol Reef, or Canyonlands. But most of the population is concentrated in a relatively narrow urban strip along the Wasatch Front, from Salt Lake City down to Provo, Lehigh, and extending toward Ogden. Further south is the Street George area. Simply put, Utah has a lot of land on the map, but not all of that land is actually convenient for millions of people to live on. And this is when geography starts to act like a bottleneck. Utah once had an extremely attractive formula: vast nature, high quality of life, and a sense of still having room to breathe. But as more and more people flock to it, those very advantages begin to turn into limitations. You can't just keep building toward the mountains, you can't turn the national park into a subdivision, and you can't simply say, if the city is crowded, we just move further away. Because going further means infrastructure must follow, travel times increase, and construction costs also rise. And then comes the number that makes the story very real. The median price of single-family homes in Salt Lake County is around $645,000, while some areas have exceeded $1 million. For a family seeking a more comfortable life, this is quite a painful turn. They move to Utah for more space and better affordability, but the influx of new residents is gradually diminishing that advantage. You can't buy more geography. And this is the thought-provoking part. When a local resident has to compete in the housing market with those who have higher financial means, the story is no longer just about rising house prices. It becomes a question of who can still afford to stay in the place they call home. Do you think Utah should prioritize the pace of development to meet new demands, or protect the scale and rhythm that initially attracted people to move here? Because Utah shows us a very clear paradox. Sometimes the most valuable thing about a place is not what it has, but the space between those things. And if Utah is starting to hit the limits of geography, then the next state is facing an even more direct problem when an entire way of life becomes a victim of its own fame. Let's head to Florida. For many years, Florida has almost been the obvious answer to a question that many Americans ask: where can I live better while paying less tax? No state income tax, warm weather, beautiful beaches, boating, and a lifestyle particularly appealing to retirees, business owners, or those who can work remotely. Florida thus once seemed like a one-way ticket to a more relaxed life, less tax burden, but still sunshine, beaches, and the amenities that many people seek. Florida is one of the largest destinations of the wave of internal migration in the U.S. But then something very Florida happened. Everyone found the answer together. When the influx of people became too large, the initial advantage began to be reclaimed by the housing market. Demand increases, real estate prices rise, and the cost of stepping into what was once considered a relatively reasonable option also goes up. The Florida bargain is no longer as certain as before, especially as housing costs and insurance-related expenses increasingly become factors to consider. And here is the most interesting paradox. Florida can help you save on taxes, but the housing market might find a way to reclaim some of those savings. A retiree on a fixed budget may be very happy not to pay state personal income tax, but that joy won't last if the house, insurance, and living expenses rise faster than their ability to adjust their income. That's why this story is not just for the wealthy. It touches on a very everyday question. Is a place still truly affordable if you have to sacrifice too many other things to live there? If you're still following along, leave a comment. Is Florida still worth moving to for its tax advantages and lifestyle? Or has the Florida bargain started to disappear? Because Florida shows a very simple rule. When a place becomes too attractive, that very attractiveness can cause the initial advantage to disappear. But if Florida is a story about taxes and housing, then the next state takes this paradox to a completely different scale, a place so vast that it seems impossible to be crowded, yet still makes people queue. Texas is so vast that you can drive for hours and still feel like you're just looking at the horizon. So how can such a vast place be crowded? The answer might be found by asking those sitting in the long lines of traffic in Dallas, Austin, or Houston. Because the paradox of Texas is not that the state is actually running out of land, but that the places where people want to live are becoming increasingly crowded. Texas is among the leading states in terms of migration, with strong economic engines like Austin, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, and San Antonio. And actually, it's easy to understand why. Texas has jobs, energy, technology, logistics, aerospace, vast land, and especially no state income tax. For someone leaving an expensive market, Texas seems like a pretty hard package to refuse. More opportunities, more space, and still the possibility of finding a home in the suburbs with a large area. But then something very Texas started happening. When the city got crowded, people didn't stop. They built further out. Austin expands into the suburbs. Dallas-Fort Worth continues to extend its suburban rings. Houston and San Antonio are also developing in a similar way. City suburbs, satellite city, farther counties. On paper, the issue of overcrowding seems to have been resolved. But on the highway, the story is completely different. You don't erase population density, you just spread it out over a larger distance. And that's where the average person starts to feel the cost. A family can buy a bigger house with a larger garage and an extra backyard, but if they have to spend extra hours on the road every day, that space is being bought with time. Roads, schools, utilities, emergency services, and essential services also have to keep up with the population. If you've ever moved to the suburbs for a quieter life and then a few years later saw a shopping center, a subdivision, and an extra highway lane appear right next to your house, you understand this paradox exactly. You moved to Texas to see the skyline. Then new subdivisions sprang up so much that the skyline also began to have planning. And this is the point worth debating. Should Texas continue to build further to accommodate the influx of new residents? Or at some point, should it accept that more space does not necessarily mean more room to live? And if Texas shows that scale can delay overcrowding but not necessarily prevent it, and if Texas attracts people with jobs, money, and space, the next state has something even more irresistible: lifestyle. Let's head to Tennessee. There is a type of place that is very dangerous for itself, a place where almost everyone wants to live. Tennessee is getting pretty close to that group. This state has an extremely simple formula. 0 state income tax, beautiful landscapes, mountains, lakes, southern culture, and a strong entertainment scene that has almost turned Nashville into a national brand. From the bustling Nashville, Knoxville nestled among the mountains, to Chattanooga with its riverside beauty, Tennessee offers something that many people are searching for: a seemingly slower pace of life without necessarily giving up economic opportunities or modern conveniences. And it is the lifestyle that is truly noteworthy. People don't just move to Tennessee for a job. They move because they want to change the way they live. A retiree might want milder winters. A family might want to avoid the high costs of coastal markets. A remote worker might want a house with more land while still being close enough to a city with good services. This is the hardest type of migration to prevent because you can't compete with a dream using an Excel spreadsheet. But then Nashville started having a very familiar problem: too many people liking the same lifestyle. Nashville is like the shiny anchor of the state, while Knoxville is increasingly resembling a version of Colorado before Colorado became a mainstream destination. And when a place once seen as an alternative becomes the first choice for too many people, the quiet roads start to get busier, land is developed faster, and new neighborhoods emerge at a pace that the old community struggles to keep up with. It's worth noting that the newcomers are not doing anything wrong. They're just doing what the people who lived there used to do, looking for a better place to live. But by adding up all those individual choices, you can create a very significant collective change. So what will you choose? A more populous Tennessee with more opportunities, or a less populated Tennessee that maintains the pace of life that made it attractive in the first place? In the end, this story is not simply about America getting overcrowded. It is a more interesting paradox. People are leaving places that are too expensive and too crowded in search of a better life, and when millions of people do the same, even those places once considered promised lands begin to change. Alabama, Idaho, Arizona, Georgia, up to Texas, each state has different limits: housing, water, time, geography, infrastructure, or simply living space. But in your opinion, which state is at the greatest risk of pressure from this wave of migration? And are you ready to move to a rapidly developing place, even knowing that this very development might change the place you love? Please leave your comments below. If you enjoy deeper analyses of the economy, migration, and the changes quietly shaping America, please like and subscribe so you don't miss the next video. This video aims to provide information and analysis based on the sources used, not financial, real estate, or policy advice. Migration and economic trends can change over time,